Served one presidential term from 1977 to 1981. Carter is known for being big in his Baptist faith, being a peanut farmer, and digging deep into politics. Before becoming president in 1977, he spent 7 years as a U.S. naval officer. He served as a Georgia state senator and then became the governor of Georgia in 1971. Today, Jimmy Carter is still alive and is the longest living U.S. president at 95 years old. Throughout this presentation, I will be focusing on Carter's journey through his presidential campaign against Gerald Ford and the results of the election. Noah will be discussing foreign policy, focusing on human rights, the Camp David Accords, and the Iranian hostage situation. Lastly, Will is going to be talking about domestic policies surrounding energy, the energy crisis, and deregulation. Run for president, he was not a household name, and even his own local newspaper wrote an article with the headline, "Jimmy Who?" This seemed to be the theme for Carter for the beginning of his campaign. After entering the Democratic primaries, Carter was said to have no chance. He was said to have no apparent political base, no organization, no standing in any of the polls, and little to no money to finance his campaign. He also had 2% name recognition. There were also already 11 other Democratic candidates that already had national name recognition that he was competing against to get the nomination. However, Carter had been planning his campaign for the last 2 years and was about to prove everyone wrong. Since the Watergate scandal was still fresh in voters' minds, he was able to use this to his advantage. Americans wanted someone who was an outsider and was distant from Washington, D.C., and all the mischief and shadiness that was happening. Carter was able to promote himself to the people as just that, an outsider. He campaigned for an open government where the American people can understand and have more control, and promoted the reorganization of government. Jimmy Carter's campaign used a lot of the same swag and techniques as you would see today, including using buttons, t-shirts, posters, necklaces, stickers, bags, and of course, many television commercials. The button shown on the right that says, "Vote for Carter, Ford will pardon you," was created to bash his opponent because during this time, Ford was being criticized because 1 month into his term, he pardoned Nixon for any crimes that may have been committed while he was in office. This included anything to do with Watergate. This was obviously recognized as being negative at the time by the public, and they didn't like the idea of Ford pardoning him. Some of the other campaign gear that he had included references of him being a peanut farmer and his huge recognizable smile, as shown on the right by the other two buttons. Interesting part about Carter's campaign is the big role that Iowa played. Carter used Iowa as a testing ground for his campaign. He was pretty much unknown everywhere except for small areas in the South, only due to his time as governor. He spent nearly a year in Iowa working to get the Iowa vote and following that he needed. At the beginning of his campaign in February 1975, in his first time in Des Moines, he had a reception at a hotel where only 5 people showed up. This is obviously pretty rare when a presidential candidate has an event. However, he was able to focus on meeting as many people as he could to get to know them more on a one-on-one basis. He continued to work hard and shake as many hands as he could during his time campaigning in Iowa. In the end, all of his hard work paid off as he ended up winning the Iowa caucus. This was also a huge deal for Iowa because it showed other states that Iowa is important and can play a huge role when being able to pick who the presidential candidates will be. Carter also made sure to go to each state long before other candidates were there to make sure that his name and face was out there in the public to up his chance at receiving delegates. Drop out of the race, this left Jimmy Carter the frontrunner, even though he didn't win a majority of delegates in the primaries. Towards the end of their campaigns and getting closer and closer to Election Day, both Carter and Ford made statements that ultimately hurt them in their need for votes. During one of the televised debates, Ford claimed that Eastern European nations did not consider themselves to be under control of the Soviet Union. This statement was wrongly interpreted by the public and ended up being evidence that Ford was inexperienced and shouldn't be the president. Carter also had a setback when he did an interview in Playboy magazine stating, quote, "I think abortions are wrong, and I will do everything I can as president to minimize the need for abortions," unquote. This was obviously pretty rare, and the public didn't really know this because he was the Democratic candidate and he got a lot of pushback from that statement. Both of these statements made the race even closer as voters started to question who they wanted as their president. Towards the end, it was an extremely close race. Carter ended up defeating Ford by a slim margin, with Carter receiving 50.1% of the popular vote and Ford receiving 48%. In terms of the Electoral College, 297 votes went to Carter and 240 to Ford. One delegate from Washington state went to Ronald Reagan due to a faithless elector. Turnout was also really low in this election, with only 54% of eligible voters going to the polls. Carter was able to win by gaining the southern states and receiving support from Catholics, Jews, and received more than 90% of the African American votes, which offset Ford's majority white vote. This election truly showed how important each individual state and vote is. 80. Carter ran for re-election. Incumbents rarely face challenges within their own party, but this did not stop Senator Edward Kennedy. Kennedy was convinced that previous Carter voters would dump Carter and vote for him instead. Carter ultimately ended up winning the renomination and was going to go up against Ronald Reagan. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan versus Carter. Reagan won his nomination with no problems, and Carter tried to use negative tactics to diss Reagan, but nothing seemed to hurt this former movie actor. The public was obviously swaying towards Reagan, but it was really shown during a televised debate between Carter and Reagan a few days before the election. This is where Carter realized that he did not stand a chance against his opponent, Ronald Reagan. In 1980, the election ended up with a sore loss for Carter. This was the first presidential incumbent loss since 1932.